better and angrier than ever. Where'd I go? And why am I back? And what is Improvisations on the Ledge anyway? I will start with attempting to answer the last question first. What is Improvisations on the Ledge? Because it is a different and new concept, even though it has a history for me personally. Most of you who will be watching it will have no idea what that is, or have limited idea of what that might be. So let's make this episode, the pilot, mostly about what it is. And this show can be considered, if I had to sum it up in a few words, it's a highly structured, planned, free improvisation. What in the world does that mean? Planned free improvisation, isn't that a contradiction in terms to say that I'm planning something that I'm improvising? Yes and no. The planning is all the stuff before the show happens, the pre-production elements, all the images that you saw, the videos, the title ideas for each of the 4 movements in the show, starting with an overture. That, for me, is kind of a prompt, as if I were an AI, and I see it and I go, overture time. I got to play something overture-y. And then I see the images which I've structured around the idea of an overture with titles and so forth, and improvise something that sort of fits that idea. So that's, in essence, what it's about. A plan, a highly structured plan, but when I sit down and perform it, as I am now, I just play. And then when I'm done with that, I just say what I'm talking about right now. Again, what I'm talking about has a basic outline, a structure, but things may change. And there's no script. Highly structured, planned, free improvisation. And each episode of this first season has a theme. The theme of this episode is I'm back, and it's also, I guess, the sub-theme would be, what is the show about? So this show is about, in effect, what this show is about. The subsequent episodes will be more, perhaps, less prosaic, delving into musical ideas and extra musical ideas. The next episode is called Sounding Natural, or Is Music Natural? And it, through music and words, investigates how music came to be what it is. Is it a natural phenomenon? So, and other episodes cover other areas. So that's what the show is about. Each episode has a theme. I structure my improvisations around that theme and my words. And I call it Improvisations on the Ledge, I suppose, because it feels risky to me, this style of improvisation, highly thematic. It's got a point, and it has a chance of failing. But that's sort of where the fun comes in. So, it does have a history. This is the first episode, but it is not the first time I've done Improvisations on the Ledge. More on that after this. A nocturne is not really a form of music, say like a song form or a sonata allegro form. It is a mood, obviously referring to the night. The composer who made it famous was, and the one who introduced me to the concept, was Frédéric Chopin. Chopin lived from, I believe, around 1810 through 1840 something. He did not live long. He died of tuberculosis. In any rate, his nocturnes are undoubtedly the most famous, so his were indeed actually inspired by another composer named John Field. But his nocturnes are some of the most gorgeous piano music you'll ever hear. And if you haven't heard them, go listen to them. They're amazing. For a long time, for me, the idea of nocturne basically did mean Chopin. And it's hard, as in writing larger formal works, to escape certain influences like Beethoven and Chopin and John Coltrane and the various people who have influenced me. By this time in my life, I'm pretty secure in my own approach to nocturne. It's my style, kind of filtered through various other styles that have influenced me, including Chopin's. But I want to get back to the history of Improvisations on the Ledge, which, as a few of you know, was a podcast that ran from about 2018 through 2021, 47 episodes, which is a lot, which may be why I stopped doing it. But the real reason I stopped doing it was just a pure podcast. I was in the same studio recording with the same equipment, and I would sit down and record an episode with no plan, unlike this one, which is highly planned. And then I would edit the bits together. It had a theme would emerge by me just sitting down and playing and talking. That's what would happen. It would just emerge as a certain kind of thematic development, both verbally and pianistically. And then I would edit it together to make it get rid of the bad parts, which mostly were ums and uhs and sniffs and the occasional pregnant pause. But the editing took a good deal longer than the actual recording or the performance. It took, whereas I would sit down and record for 30 to 60 minutes, it would take me maybe 8 hours to edit it together into a podcast form. And by the time I was done, it didn't feel very improvisational on the ledgy. So I tabled it with the idea that I would do a live version. And 4 years later, that's almost exactly 4 years later, I believe I quit in October of 2021. I'm back doing it as a live show. And the difference, of course, is the performance itself is completely live. All the production is done on the front end. It's just as much work, if not more. But it's a more satisfying performance experience for me. So that's where the show came from. Where it's going, I have a season planned out, which you'll hear about if you watch. And where it's going right now is the next improvisation. Speaking of Chopin, waltz was another form that he is quite well known for. But of course, the waltz has several other histories. It's a court dance that goes back to the court era of Europe. And then it became, of course, a big sensation in Vienna with the Strauss brothers in the late, I believe, the 1890s. And that's all well and good. Those are nice. My connection to the waltz is the jazz waltz, as performed or composed by several great jazz composers and artists. My favorites are by a pianist named Randy Weston. But it's the jazz waltz, of course, is a swing feel, and that's kind of what I connect to as an American musician. Now, I wanted to address something that came up in the opening when I said I'm back better and angrier than ever. I already said where I went. I got away from this podcast, and why I'm back, because I wanted to do it as a live show. Definitely better. I keep practicing. I keep refining my art. The anger part, I have to admit, is connected to that. It is connected to the idea that it doesn't really matter how good you are anymore in terms of artistic quality. That those things are generally not considered important anymore or relevant. We've been, I believe, the really great artists around right now are, and original artists are hiding out somewhere in their studios, being ignored for the most part. So that goes hand in hand with the glorification of superficial in art, if you can call it that. But that's where we are. We keep going. Artists who are serious about the craft and the beauty of the tradition and being connected to the tradition, we just keep going. And speaking of tradition, there have been, I'm going to say, 5 to 10 artists who have defined or been fundamental in me defining how I do things. One of them is Bach, another is Beethoven, John Coltrane, from the singer-songwriter tradition, people like the Beatles and Richard Rodgers and many others in that tradition. But my point is, these are the people that are my models, that I set my own artistic standards on what they do. And I try to build from those, what my models did, and create my own thing out of it. And speaking of that, I'm ending with this, which is built on the model set by a very great musician from the 17th, 18th centuries.